By the early 1920s, Americans were tiring of crusades. They were tired of trying to make the world safe for democracy. And at home, progressivism, which attempted to improve the quality of life for all citizens, was wearing thin. The nation joined President Warren G. Harding in what he called a return to normalcy and the good life made possible by a surging economy. It was the Jazz Age, the Roaring '20s, a decade in which the old belief in hard work, thrift, and personal restraint seemed to be crumbling beneath an onslaught of movie madness, jazz babies, and bootleg gin. Prosperity spawned a new mass consumer culture based around spending, leisure, and fun. During the 1920s, Americans enjoyed the highest standard of living in the world. Spurred by new inventions and technological innovations, the United States economy was in the midst of a third industrial revolution. The shift from coal to electricity helped double worker productivity. A wave of mergers created new production giants, run by men who paid as much attention to research, marketing, and advertising as to manufacturing itself. What the country's industries made was also changing, as production shifted from things like steel and oil to goods and services manufactured directly for consumers. Electrical appliances, radios, furnishings, motion pictures, and especially automobiles. To realize his dream of making a car for everyone, Henry Ford pioneered a moving assembly line that sped up work, saved costs, and cut the time it took to make a car from more than 12 to under 2 hours. Henry produced the Model T, reliable, affordable, each one just like the other, and you could get it in any color you wanted, as long as it was black. In 1914, Henry started to pay his workers the unheard of wage of $5 a day. His friends thought him mad, but higher wages were good for business.
You had created a system which had mass production, where people stood on an assembly line and did over and over the same job. It made people discontent. And there was a lot of labor turnover at Ford. And one of the ways in which Ford wanted to guarantee a predictable labor force, that people would stay and that you could count on them coming every day, was to raise wages. And so to pay his workers considerably above other firms, that people would not only be able to buy Fords, but other products at the time.
Across America, companies raised workers' wages to increase their buying power. They also improved workers' benefits, offering old age pensions, paid vacations, and insurance. Still, few Americans could afford to buy an auto outright, so automobile makers pioneered another innovation, buying on credit. In the old days, you bought only what you could afford. In modern America, buy now, pay later was becoming a way of life. The next step forward came from General Motors boss Alfred Sloan, who recognized that cars could be sold on the basis of comfort and style as well as price. Applying the laws of Paris dressmakers to the automobile industry, GM introduced a wide range of differently priced cars, which they changed every year. Keep the consumer dissatisfied, Sloan decided, and therefore eager to buy a newer and fancier model. By 1930, Americans owned 8 out of 10 of all the world's automobiles. The automobile accelerated America's shift from a rural to an urban nation. By 1920, for the first time in history, more Americans lived in cities than in the countryside. Drawn by jobs and the desire for a better life, 6 million more people moved to urban areas during the decade. Symbols of American prosperity and ingenuity, cities built new stores, theaters, and skyscrapers. Suburbs boomed too, as growing numbers of white-collar workers used autos, streetcars, and trains to commute between office and home.
When you really do begin to build a society around the automobile, it will allow people to live outside central cities in a much greater degree. It's the central contributing factor to the expansion of the suburbs, which is really 19th century cities and early 20th century cities. Only the very wealthy lived in the suburbs. And provided you have the money to make it all happen, the automobile allows the city to expand much wider into the suburbs and to minimize public transportation. It heightens people's desire to have a private mode of transportation and a private lifestyle in the suburbs.
The automobile in the 1920s changes almost every aspect of American life. The whole landscape begins to change. Small-town grocery stores, for example, often closed up because people could hop into their car and drive to a bigger city nearby. And many people thought that the car was anti-religious because a lot of people, instead of going to church on Sunday, went for a Sunday drive. The car changed the nature of dating habits. For the first time, young people could escape the chaperonage of their parents. The car also led to drive-in movies and then eventually drive-in banks. And so it's hard to overestimate what the car did to American habits in a whole variety of ways.
Cities were the centers of the new mass consumer culture, the proving grounds of new forms of entertainment and leisure. To create a consumer out of a citizen required profound changes in people's values and behaviors. And the segment of the nation's society that changed the most were women. Women's lives were changing fast. In 1920, the 19th Amendment had guaranteed women the right to vote. More women than ever before held paying jobs.
In the 1920s, young women in particular enjoyed more freedom than young women had ever had before. Women were going to high school in increasing numbers, and many of them were graduating from high school. Women were also going to college in increasing numbers, and they were going to coeducational colleges. They were living away from their families. They were dating. They were engaged in sports activities to an extent that women had never been engaged in sports activities before. They were increasingly throwing off the restraints of an earlier generation. They wore looser clothing instead of being tightly constrained by corsets the way women had been constrained in the 19th century. They cut their hair, they went to speakeasies, they drank bathtub gin, and this is the image we have of the 1920s. We call these young women the flappers.
Inside the home, another kind of revolution was taking place.
The 20s were a period when not only the automobile changed things, but a lot of other breakthroughs came along. Electricity was one of them. The country got electrified during that time. Of course, you have to realize that a large number of people didn't profit from electricity. The farmer, for example, didn't get electricity in many cases until the end of the 1930s. Electricity enabled you to buy all kinds of appliances, toasters, electric stoves. Just having an electric light meant a great deal.
New household appliances were reducing the drudgery of laundry, food preparation, and cleaning. That didn't mean that women spent any less time doing housework, but the nature of their work was changing. For now, they had to make smart choices from the wealth of new home consumer products. By then, too, manufacturers knew that it was no longer men, but women who were deciding what products to buy. Once associated with con artists and snake oil salesmen, the country's advertisers had helped mobilize Americans in support of World War I. Now advertising educated Americans about the tidal wave of new products entering the marketplace and improving people's lives.
In the 1920s, the advertising industry came of age. In the 1920s, You had radio for the first time, so you could advertise through the airwaves. Also in the 1920s, there was a whole host of magazines directed at the middle class, directed at the working class, magazines directed at women, giving the advertising industry a chance to promote its products throughout a whole variety of media.
Advertising was something you needed when you could produce so many goods that there weren't enough customers. And advertising was the art of convincing somebody that they needed something they didn't even know they needed. And so you would reach them with messages, with images, and very often you could sell the idea of beauty. If you drove a beautiful car, you'd have a beautiful woman. And if you smoked cigarettes suavely, love would appear in your life. And the one I love the most is when someone had decided that Americans needed deodorants, and an advertiser thought up the best ad line of all time. Let's turn every armpit into a charm pit.
With the help of psychologists, advertisers tapped into unconscious fears, urges, and desires. Americans learned that sneaker smell, halitosis, and the dreaded BO could ruin your life. Learned that love could be found in a face cream, and that happiness was no farther away than the purchase of a new refrigerator or luxury automobile. Back in the old days, it took a well-to-do woman hours to do her hair and put on the 5 to 10 pounds of expensive corsets, petticoats, and outer garments necessary to be seen in public. Now, simple, affordable fashions could be bought in any department store.
Because for women, the big thing in advertising of the 1920s was make a woman feel guilty. So, advertising for cosmetics was, are you beautiful enough for your husband? Are your hands soft enough? Are you getting wrinkles? Is your hair getting gray? Is he going to be looking at his cute little secretary in the office? Well, what you need is a little lipstick and rouge and a little hair dye, and then you too can be a woman that your husband will be proud to be seen with.
Magazines, beauty contests, modeling, and the movies provided the role models. In 1921, Clara Bow would turn the screen test she won in a Photoplay magazine photo contest into a major movie career.
She has her own sense of style. She can be assertive. She's the one who manipulates things. She controls the action, and she wins in the end.
Movies brought fantasies to life, provided a dream world of opulence and adventure, mystery and love. They mocked the old Victorian notions of respectability, class distinctions, and female purity.
Even small towns had movie theaters. People in the 20s, especially young people, flocked to the movies, and they claimed that they learned a great deal. Young men claimed they learned how to kiss by watching movies. Certain kinds of stars were emulated and became celebrities. How they smoked a cigarette or how they held their head became mimicked by all the people that went to the movies. So the 20s saw the great expansion of the movie industry.
It's hard now to recognize just how controversial the movies were back in the 1920s. Comic Charlie Chaplin thumbing his nose at authority. Film flappers Clara Bow and Joan Crawford dancing and flirting. Rudolph Valentino and John Gilbert making women swoon with their smolderingly passionate gazes. Talk about assaults on traditional family values. This was risque stuff. By the 1920s, movies were the most powerful and influential medium of culture in the U.S. The movies were not only giving Americans new heroes and heroines, but also redefining beauty and masculinity. On screen and off, the stars provided the new role models of a mass consumer society. They served as the nation's leisure experts, living in lavish mansions, driving expensive cars, falling in and out of love and marriage. The movies and its stars also celebrated the exciting commercial nightlife and new music of the nation's cities. For if the silent screen provided the images of the new consumer society, then jazz provided its sound. Like the decade itself, jazz was fast, loud, and raucous, uninhibited, joyous, and highly controversial. It came from the dance halls and clubs of an oppressed people, African Americans from the nation's South, who had been flooding into northern cities since the First World War. Born in New Orleans, jazz traveled up the Mississippi to Kansas City and the south side of Chicago, then moved on to New York City's Harlem. By the early 1920s, Harlem was the largest black community in the country and the center of black commerce and culture, the likes of which the nation had never seen. Here could be found Marcus Garvey and his Universal Negro Improvement Association, the largest black organization in the history of the nation. A black printer from Jamaica who came to New York in 1916, Garvey built a following of more than 500,000 members by championing racial pride, economic independence, and self-rule. In his African Orthodox Church, worshipers could glorify a black Christ and a black Virgin Mary. The pomp and spectacle of his many auxiliary organizations, like the Universal Black Cross Nurses and Black Eagle Flying Corps, appealed to the pride of working-class African Americans, whom Garvey encouraged to establish and support their own businesses. In the 1920s, Harlem was also the main center of the New Negro, the name given to a new generation of African American city dwellers who were prosperous, independent, and self-assured. Here, too, was a flowering of African American arts and letters known as the Harlem Renaissance. Writers and artists who spoke in an African American voice about African American lives.
We young and Negro artists who create now intend to express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame. If white people are pleased, we are glad. If they are not, it doesn't matter. Langston Hughes, poet and novelist.
And whites would go into Harlem and enjoy the music, the creativity of African Americans. The Cotton Club, for example, served white patrons exclusively. African Americans could perform in these clubs. They could not sit in the audience.
Broadcasting live from the Cotton Club, radio carried the sounds of Duke Ellington and his orchestra into homes throughout the nation. Downtown, Cecil and Blake's Shuffle Along became the first black musical to make it on Broadway. On records, Bessie Smith's soulful blues won the hearts of white and black listeners.
Bessie Smith, who is often called the Empress of the Blues, perhaps personified blues women of the era. And to understand blues women, they represented creativity and lower class strivings. The songs that Bessie Smith and other women sang, they sang about the hardships, about love lost, about the difficulties of being black.
White musicians also took up jazz and blues, reaching even broader audiences. Radio and records spread the new sounds far and wide, permanently transforming American music. Young Americans embraced the black-derived music and dance forms as their own. But not everyone was pleased with the new music or movies or any of the other offerings of the new mass consumer culture.
Dancing instructor Fenton T. Bott voiced the concerns of many Americans, both black and white, about the evil influences of jazz. Its primitive rhythms, the savage crash and bang, many people believed was seducing American youths into temptation and sin. The United States, many people feared, was becoming a nation of lawbreakers. And we would hear the same sorts of complaints again with the arrival of rock and roll in the 1950s, and then with the arrival of rap in the 1980s.
On January 16, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution made the manufacture or sale of alcoholic beverages illegal nationwide. This culminated a crusade that had begun 100 years earlier. And at first, Americans did indeed drink less. But the noble experiment quickly broke down. More and more people began to break the law, drinking alcohol provided by booming crime syndicates. The open flaunting of prohibition and the association of the commercial nightlife with crime and immorality hardened growing divisions in American society. In fact, the 1920s revolution in manners and morals was limited in its scope. The majority of Americans remained traditionalists, God-fearing Protestants who held on to small-town values and watched with growing fear and condemnation what they saw as the erosion of traditional values and morality. World War I had also unleashed Anglo-Americans' fear of foreigners, giving rise to hostility and violence against people different than themselves. A revived Ku Klux Klan accused American Catholics, now more than 1/3 of all Americans, of placing their allegiance to the Pope above that of their country. Jews, the Klan charged, dominated motion pictures, popular music, and bootlegging. The Klan used violence to terrorize African Americans and immigrants. The Ku Klux Klan had tremendous appeal to many Protestant Americans in the nation's heartland, especially the Midwest. By 1923, the Klan controlled 3 state governments and claimed 5 million members. During the 1920s, Congress passed a series of new laws that severely restricted the number of immigrants entering the United States from Europe and virtually banned immigrants from Asia. The river of Europeans who had poured into the nation for decades was reduced to a small stream. The laws, however, said nothing about the Western Hemisphere. During the 1920s, 500,000 Mexicans would pour into the United States to work in the farms, fields, and factories of California and the Southwest. More and more Mexicans also began to settle in the large cities of the Midwest. While nativists waged their war against ethnic Americans, evangelical groups denounced the materialism, hedonism, and godlessness of the urban United States. The nation was splitting in two, engaging in a war of cultures that would last the decade. In the summer of 1925, this war of cultures witnessed one of its most memorable battles in the small town of Dayton, Tennessee. Alarmed by the challenges of modern science to the Bible, the Tennessee legislature had passed a law outlawing the teaching of evolution in the state schools. When high school teacher John Scopes taught evolution anyway, he was arrested and tried. 3-time presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan argued for the state. Scopes was represented by Clarence Darrow, the nation's most famous defense lawyer. Under intense national press coverage, the monkey trial, as it became known, dragged on through the hot days of July. In the end, Scopes was convicted. But Darrow's withering cross-examination made Bryan look foolish. "1926 provided another test of strength between the traditionalists and the modernists, this time in a boxing match between Jack Dempsey and Gene Tunney for the heavyweight championship of the world. As part of the nation's 150th birthday party, the city of Philadelphia hosted the biggest sporting event in American history.
Jack Dempsey was the most popular heavyweight of all time. He came out of the West. He was a natural fighter, a brawler. He was a Protestant fundamentalist. He represented small-town traditional American values. His opponent, Gene Tunney, was an Irish Catholic. He was a New York City slicker. who married a debutante, and who read Shakespeare while he trained for the match. Here you have a clear clash of cultures. Not in a courtroom or in a presidential election, but right there in the boxing ring, man to man. The first bout is disputed, but goes to Tunney. Second bout, Tunney beats Dempsey again. The modernists come out triumphant, at least in sports.
The 1920s were the golden age of sports. There was Bill Tilden in tennis and Bobby Jones in golf. There was the galloping ghost, Red Grange, whose bursts of speed attracted spectators to college football and then to the new sport of professional football. And towering above them all was the Sultan of SWAT, the great Babe Ruth. His soaring home runs on the field and huge appetites off the field so well represented the extravagances of the Roaring Twenties. The greatest of all the heroes of the decade was an unassuming farm boy who burst upon the American imagination from out of the western skies in 1927. No one had ever flown non-stop across the Atlantic Ocean until Charles Lindbergh landed in Paris on May 21, 1927. And he had done it alone. Lucky Lindy became an instant celebrity and the hero of the age. In an age of ballyhoo image and hype, here was the real thing. Courageous, handsome, resourceful, the living embodiment of the greatness of the American people and technology. Man and machine working as one to master the skies and restore the nation's faith in itself. Heroes like Babe Ruth and Lucky Lindy helped create that sense of belonging lost in the culture wars of the 1920s. Another thing that most Americans had in common was their belief that capitalism was bringing about a better world.
The chief business of the American people is business. The man who builds a factory builds a temple. The man who works there worships there. President Calvin Coolidge.
President Coolidge's now famous words indicate the almost religious faith that many Americans placed in business. The gospel of business told Americans of all backgrounds that prosperity would bring about fulfillment of the American dream. But the prosperity of the 1920s rested on weak foundations. The growing concentration of wealth into fewer and fewer hands, cutbacks in industrial production, and a binge in speculative investments were laying the groundwork for catastrophe. When the stock market crashed in October of 1929, the party was over. They didn't know it at the time, but Americans were witnessing the start of what would become the worst and most prolonged economic depression in the nation's history.